Hey everybody, World War Guy here today, and today we're going to look at the Belgian M89-36 Mauser rifle, and of course, its bayonet that went with it. In this video, we're going to look at the features, production, and the service history of this particular rifle. Now before we begin, I do want to say that this video is heavily inspired by Sea and Arsenal and Forgotten Weapons, but it will not contain nearly as much information as if it was done by either channel. But it will contain more information than what is currently available on YouTube. Now before we look into the M89-36 rifle, we do have to look at what the Belgian army was using prior, the M1889 Mauser rifle. I won't go into too much detail, and I encourage you to check out Sea and Arsenal's very detailed video about said rifle. But nonetheless, the Belgian M89 rifle was adopted in 1889, while mass production didn't start until 1892. The rifle was 50 inches long, weighed 9¼ pounds, and held 5 rounds of the Belgian 7.65x53 cartridge in a single stack external magazine. Fabrique Nationale was the main producer of these rifles, while MAE, or Manufacture d'Armes de l'État, the government contract, mainly produced replacement parts, although there are some examples of some MAE-made rifles. Prior to the Great War and during the Great War, the M1889 rifle was the main service rifle for the Belgian military. Prior to the war, there were shooting competitions held where any Belgian soldier could compete in, and they would shoot their M1889 rifle using only iron sights up to 600 meters, about 656 yards. They would shoot with and without their bayonets. Now, these competitions were highly encouraged by the Belgian military, as you can imagine, because it improved overall marksmanship. And I am unsure of this, but it appears that these competitions were held every year up until 1914. And thanks to these competitions and the improvement of overall marksmanship in the Belgian army, when the Germans invaded in 1914, many of them thought they were actually fighting a much larger Belgian force than there actually was. And this was due to the competitions held where Belgians could improve on their marksmanship using only their battle rifle, no scopes or anything like that. The M89 rifles were used throughout the war in the Belgian army, but since the FN factories were occupied by the German armies, Belgium had to resort to building their rifles elsewhere. The Birmingham facility in England was used by Belgian workers in order to produce more of these Mauser rifles. But mainly due to old and worn machinery, production was very slow, with around 20 rifles a day on average. Now, by 1916, though, that average was up to 2,000 rifles a day. Belgium followed the Entente's tradition in buying arms from the United States, and the United States was more than happy to make an extra dollar. The Hawkins and Allen Arms Company in Norwich, Connecticut was hired to produce these Mauser rifles in 1915. And by 1916, the first rifles were delivered. These rifles were exceptionally well made with a very low rejection rate. Unfortunately, because the Belgian government was unable to offer more money per rifle as, for example, France or Great Britain could, and due to miscalculations and delays in deliveries, the cost of labor and raw materials put a financial strain on the company, and thus by 1917, the Hawkins and Allen Arms Company went into bankruptcy. Due to the delays in shipment of the Mauser rifles, many of the rifles did not arrive until the end of the Great War. Thus, many of these rifles were given to Belgian occupation forces in Germany. Since the Mauser rifles were sparse during the war, Belgium had to resort to using many French rifles, such as the Lebel 1886-93 or the Berthier, as you can see in many photos. The Belgian M89 Mauser, alongside with the M89-16 carbine, was used extensively after the Great War. In fact, it was not until 1935 that the Belgian government would adopt a new rifle. In fact, the M89 rifle was still in Belgian arsenals when the German armies invaded in 1940, a lot of them on the front lines. After the Great War, Belgium continued to use and issue the M89 rifle. When Germany was expanding their armies in the 1930s, Belgium saw the writing on the wall and decided it was time to adopt a new modern rifle. Many politicians argued whether MAE or FN should produce the majority of the rifles, and there was also debate whether they should adopt a brand new rifle made from scratch or convert old rifles to fit a new modern standard. In the end, it was decided that MAE would produce the majority of the new rifles using as many surplus parts as possible. Thus, the M19-35 rifle was born. We're not here yet. We still have a rifle to talk about before. After World War I, Belgium received a lot of German Gewehr 98 rifles as part of reparations. The M19-35 rifle would recycle many of those German rifles using parts such as stocks and receivers, while FN would produce new-made barrels. From 1935 to 1939, MAE produced around 60,000 rifles. And after the German armies invaded Poland in 1939, production was increased and FN produced around 10,000 rifles within a 5-month period. Now, you probably are wondering, why did they decide to update old rifles to fit a modern standard rather than building brand new rifles? And the reason is, well, the Great Depression. The Great Depression took a toll on almost every single country in the world, including Belgium, who was particularly hit hard during World War I. So there wasn't really the financial possibility to put in to build brand new rifles. So it was thought that by taking old rifles and just changing certain parts, updating them to fit a modern standard, it would be quick and easy and also cheap. That was the idea behind it. Of course, Belgium had a large stockpile of the M89 rifles that needed to be converted and updated. And thus, this brings us finally to our rifle for today, the M89-36 Mauser rifle. Now, this rifle sits at 43 inches tall and weighs 8.5 pounds. The idea to convert the M89 rifles into this rifle we see here today was to save money, time, and resources, but this proved to be very ineffective, as I explained with the M35 rifle. The conversion process was done so that this rifle would greatly resemble that of the M35, with the exception of retaining the external magazine as well as the Belgian-style stock, as the M35 used German stocks and parts. In the initial conversion process, only worn and broken M89 rifles were used as to keep the more modern rifles in service for the time being. During the building process, MAE converted surplus parts, assembled and finished rifles, while FN produced new-made barrels and other surplus parts, and AEP, Ancien Etablissement Piper, would share the workload with both MAE and FN. Now to explain some of the conversion process done to these rifles. First of all, an extension was added to the receiver as to better fit the new-made barrels. Trigger guards and magazines were retained from the M89 rifle, but were modified so it could use locking screws. New barrel bands were produced exactly the same as those on the M35. The aforementioned new-made barrels produced by FN, and most stocks were actually laminated stocks from old cut-down existing stocks. So many of them will actually contain 2 stocks put into one. All of these were converted rifles using a mixture of surplus and new-made parts with cut stocks. These rifles actually turned out to be of very high quality. This gives a good idea of the skill and craftsmanship by the workers in this time, especially considering how long of a process this took them. By May of 1940, 80,000 of these rifles were produced before the German invasion. In fact, during the German invasion, many of these were still in production. Of course, that didn't last long, since 18 days is not enough time to continue producing thousands of rifles. Now, after talking about the short production of the rifle, let's take a closer look at the rifle, its markings and features, so you can get a better look at what this rifle has to offer. Alright, so let's start at the rear of the rifle. As you can see, it still retains the very distinctive stock from the M89 with the sharp corner at the rear here. On the rear, you can see the contract number on the butt plate. So as you can see, this very faint circle here, that is the marking we are looking at. It is on the right side of the rifle stock. And in this circle, there is normally a fancy L in the middle. And around the L, such as on the top, you would have MAE, and on the bottom, you would have 1936. The L in the middle would stand for King Leopold III, as he was the king during the development of these rifles. Prior rifles with the M89 would have A for King Albert, and then some very early ones you'd have another L for King Leopold II. MAE on the top would be for the arsenal that it was made, so MAE made this one. And the 1936 is for the year that the model was adopted. It is not a year that the model or that this rifle was made in, so this rifle could have been made 1936 throughout 1940. This specific marking is a final acceptance marking, and the year, like I said, is not a manufacture date. So you can actually find some of these rifles without this marking, which means that it was captured by the Germans before this was ever finally accepted. Now there is normally another marking on the stock, but unfortunately I don't have it, which could be because it was either sanded down or because my rifle doesn't have it. But I will post a picture here in a second. This marking found on the stock is another military acceptance marking to indicate that the recycled stock was accepted for use. They are only found on the M35 and the M89-36, as you can expect, as those were the only rifles that use recycled stocks. Now, this could mean that my rifle, since it was possibly sanded out, means the marking is just faded away, or this is one of the newly made rifles, or the newly made rifle stocks. Now, moving up the receiver, we can see plenty of different markings, which we will look at in a second, do not worry. The most obvious and biggest one here is Manufacture d'Armes de l'État, which proves or shows that it was made at MAE. Now going off to the left side of the rifle, we can see a contract number, which is matching to the stock. As you can see, it's very faint. I don't even know if I can properly get it on camera, but believe me, it is the same number as the one on the receiver. Original contract numbers from the M89 rifles were taken off and new ones were added. This would most likely explain the inlay of wood in the stock with the matching contract number. Of course, as I said, this example is relatively worn away, again, possibly due to sanding at some point. Now you may have noticed that I'm calling these contract numbers and not serial numbers, and that is because FN applied contract numbers to rifles made for a government contract. Contract numbers were dictated by the number of rifles ordered by the customer. But when doing my research, I found that for this specific rifles, it appears that they were called serial numbers. This may be because they are rifles made by MAE and not FN. All in all, contract numbers and serial numbers are basically the same idea. It just depends, such as contract numbers are for government contracts, and serial numbers are more for commercial contracts. Now, of course, this is specific to FN, not all manufacturers, just FN. For the remainder of the video, I will continue to use contract numbers when talking about this. Now, contract numbers would be found on the receiver, on the barrel, on the bolt, on the stock, and on the butt plate. Looking back at the receiver, there is a Belgian government proof mark, the EGB. Now, of course, this is very small. I will try to post a picture of a close-up of it so you can probably see what the marking looks like. This marking indicates that the part functions properly. This marking was only applied once or to all major components, as seen here again on the barrel. So these would basically prove that, hey, this part works as a major component, nothing to worry about. Of course, as I said, it can be seen once, or it can be seen on the major components, as you would see it on the receiver and the barrel, as those are pretty big, important parts that you really want to function properly. And then right here, this little marking is a Z or N in a box. I say Z or N because considering how some of the markings are right side up and others are on the side, I'm not entirely sure which letter it is. And this is where it gets a little confusing to me. On the M1889 rifles, this marking would be an FN final quality control stamp. But they're only present on the early models of the M89. Normally, all markings were erased when producing the M89-36. They would scrub them off to place brand new fresh markings. And this leads me to believe that this is more likely a small inspector's parts marking. But it is possible that the early M89 markings was kept or simply just not erased. If anyone has more information on this, please let me know, as I am unsure exactly of what that marking means. You can see the same marking on the bolt release lever and the magazine floor plate, which are all parts kept from the M89 rifle. This is why I'm a little confused on which marking it really is supposed to be. If it is in fact the original M89 markings, it would indicate that these parts, specific parts, were made before 1898. But again, please take this with a big grain of salt as I cannot confirm the markings. While we are at the magazine, we can see another contract number, but this time it is only 4 numbers instead of 5 as seen on the receiver and barrel and stock. I am again sure of this reason because during production of the M89 rifles, contract numbers ascended from 1 to 9,999 and then reset with a prefix letter such as A1, A9999. Because of this leads me to believe that this is the original contract marking that was left on the floor plate instead of being given a new one, like with the letter Z and N markings. I am unsure of this, so please understand that this could be not correct. Before we look at the bolt and its markings, there are a few markings I want to look at. Nearly all parts had small inspector's parts accepted markings. We can see this on the rear sight underneath here, on the front barrel band, near the entry for the cleaning rod, on the rear barrel band swivel, on the trigger guard, and even on a screw for the rear swivel. You can find a mixture of circles, squares, and hexagons on these parts, with of course different letters in there depending on the inspector. Now we can finally look at the bolt. I was unable to find information to if the bolt was left in the white or if it was painted black over a dull industrial black oxide finish. Based on original examples, it looks like these were applied with finish. The bolts were the same bolts used on the M89 rifles, but they were updated to use the 98 Mauser style rear. What they did was to weld an extension to the rear, as this would transform the bolt into a cock-on open system rather than a cock-on close. Looking at the markings, you can see another contract number on the bolt. This one is mismatching from the rifle, unfortunately. So I assume they were put together sometime after the Second World War. On the bolt head, there is a number 5, and unfortunately, I have no idea what this means, as I could not find anything in my research to this, as I could not find other examples with a number on the bolt head. On the underside of the bolt handle, there is an H in a circle. This would indicate another small inspector's parts acceptance marking. And then next to it, it appears that there are some leftover markings from when it was a bolt for the M89 rifles. As I explained, they were all erased to apply new markings, but it's possible that some of them were left behind. On the safety flag, and the rear of the body just right there, there was a number showing 9477, or so it appears that way. I have no idea what this means, as I could not find any information on this as well. I do not think it is a sort of contract number, but again, it's not an acceptance marking either. Very interesting, but again, it could be a contract number, making the bolt also a mismatch from itself. So now let's look at some actual interesting features of the rifle. Let's start with the rear sights. Now these are your very typical Mauser sights commonly seen on the Kar 98K, as well as other Mausers such as the Hugo Mauser, M48 Mauser. Now the battle sights, or the battle zero for the rifle, is 100 meters, and it goes up to 1,900 meters. To adjust your sights, you simply squeeze the sights here and you can move up. Very simple. And from there you can adjust your sightage. On the flip side, if you flip it up, you can also see these numbers on the reverse, as you can commonly see on the Kar 98 and Hugo M48 Mausers. The handguard is rather small at the top, as it only covers right in front of the rear sight and barely moves up past the rear barrel band. Otherwise, the barrel is completely left exposed at the front, and as well as by the sights and receiver. Now you may be able to notice a slight color difference between the receiver and the barrel. Now this is because, as I mentioned, the receivers and barrels were made at different times. The receivers were leftover receivers from the M89 rifles, while the barrels were all newly made rifles. And somewhere around here is where they would attach the barrel and the receiver. So it's very normal to see a 2 different color combination on these rifles. Now the front sights are very simple. You just have your typical pointed front sight, while the guard for it are the, I believe, bunkhorn sights are what they called. Again, I could be wrong, so please correct me. But otherwise, very simple sight, very easy to read. The M89-36 rifle used the 7.65 by 53 ammunition. Now, these are dummy rounds. They're not going to fire anything. Now, to load them, you could either single load them or use a 5-round stripper clip. But on these dummies, they do not work very well in stripper clips, so we will just single load them. Now, when loading them, they are stored in an external magazine and they are single stacked, as we can see here. And otherwise, to load it is as simple as with any other rifle. You just cycle it through until you run out. Now, here's an example of the Spitzer rounds produced by Belgium. As you can see on the rear, on the head stamp, FN for Fabrique Nationale, S was the marking for Spitzer rounds, and 35 was the year. So this was made in 1935. Now, this round was made for either two reasons. Either it was for the Belgian BAR, which used the same caliber and were the only Belgian arms to be issued Spitzer rounds, or this was a round made for a contract for another country that adopted the Spitzer cartridge. Now, I'm unsure of this, but nonetheless, it's still very cool. Now, something interesting with this rifle is you can actually take the magazine out. The reason for this is for replacement as well as cleaning. There is a small button right there. They can just take a normal round, push it in, and it just slides right out. Now, Belgian soldiers were not issued magazines. They were issued stripper clips, as this system would be very terrible to take out and put back in, as you have to keep pushing this button. But here you can see a better look at the magazine itself. Here you would unscrew this screw, and the floor plate would flip open, and the spring would come out. Oddly enough, the ammunition will not fall out if you do this, so this is mostly a cleaning, or a reason to clean. As well as the hole here is just another drainage system in case there's water in here or some oil needs to come out or whatever else. To put it back in, you just simply slide it right in. Now, I do have a separate video explaining how to disassemble the rifle as well as the bolt, so if you're curious about that, I encourage you to check that video out as well. Well, not too bad for 50 yards. As the Mauser M89-36 was adopted and produced until 1940, this became one of the main battle rifles for the Belgian army. When the German armies invaded Belgium in May of 1940, Belgium was still issuing the M89 rifle and the M89-16 carbine. At the same time, Belgium was also issuing the M35 rifle and the M89-36 rifle. That's 4 rifles for one army. You can see how unprepared Belgium was at the beginning of the war, as well as how long the conversion process took, as they were unable to convert all the rifles, or at least the vast majority of the rifles, prior to the beginning of the war. The new M35 and M89-36 rifle were designed to take the brand new Spitzer ammo of the 7.65 by 53 cartridge. But all soldiers were actually issued round-nose ammunition, even those with the brand new rifles. And this is because the M89 rifle and the M89-16 carbine were designed to only take round-nose ammunition. This is due to the feeding process. It could only take round-nose ammunition. Therefore, every soldier, no matter what rifle they were issued, were given round-nose ammunition. And this is so that there was no mistake in the distribution of ammunition. So those with M89 rifles would not accidentally get Spitzer ammo, rendering their rifles useless. The only soldiers issued Spitzer ammunition was the BAR gunners. They used the same caliber, but their ammunition was a bit more pressurized than for the rifles. No Spitzer ammunition was produced for the Belgian military and their rifles. Any Spitzer ammunition made by Belgium prior to 1940 was either made for the BAR or possibly for other contracts for other countries. The M35 and the M89-36 rifle had a very short service life in the Belgian military. And this is because, as they were produced first in 1935 and 1936, and production ended in 1940 with the German invasions, that only leaves about a 4 to 5 year period where the Belgians could actually use this. Prior to that, the Belgians, as I explained, used the M89 rifle and the M89-16 carbines, which were also used during World War II. Nonetheless, we can still talk a little bit about the Belgian army during the Second World War. Belgium claimed neutrality as it had done in the First World War, but Germany said nuts to that and invaded Belgium May 10, 1940. Breaking Hitler's guarantee that Belgium would not be invaded. Never trust Hitler's word on anything. Nonetheless, Belgium held out for 18 days against all odds. Prior to the invasion, the Belgians increased their fortifications with the KW line, a 60-kilometer defense line stretching from Koningsreuth to Wavre. I apologize, I am not good with my Flemish or my Dutch. So check the bottom of the screen to see the proper town name. They also improved their defense lines on the Albert Canal and improved many fortifications around the country. By the time of the invasion, Belgium fielded around 650,000 soldiers. That was nearly 20% of the entire male population in Belgium at the time. During the invasion, Belgium was caught by surprise as the Blitzkrieg stunned the Belgian defenders. The Belgians were unable to hold off as their grandfathers did during the Great War, but there are some examples of fierce defending by the Belgian forces. If you listen to Sabaton, you may have heard of the song Resistant Bite, and this is about the true story of the Chasseurs Ardennais who held out for 18 days in Ardennes Forest, despite being heavily outnumbered and poorly supplied. As we mentioned during the Great War, the Chasseurs Ardennais were so well trained with their rifles that oftentimes the German invaders thought they were fighting a much larger force than there actually was. Unfortunately, I was unable to find more information on the M89-36 rifle in Belgian service, but it is important to note that Belgium fiercely contested the German invasion. Although they surrendered after 18 days of brutal fighting, the Belgians offered enough time for the French, British, and some Belgian soldiers to escape via Dunkirk. Along with other factors, the Belgians gave Britain enough time to gather up their forces and to fight another day. But the story does not end there. In typical German fashion of not letting good war supplies go to waste, the Germans captured thousands of these rifles and other rifles as well, and put them to good use. Many of these rifles mostly went to the Eastern Front along with stockpiles of ammunition. And note that no 7.65x53 ammunition was produced after Belgium's capitulation. Many of the rifles issued to the German army oftentimes were mostly security forces, such as the Wehrschütze, plant protection, or rear echelon troops. The Congo was the only other country to adopt and issue the M89-36 Mauser rifle. They had opted to adopt this rifle rather than the M35 because they claimed that it would be an easier transition from the M89 Mauser rifle, but it is more likely due to economical decisions. Most, if not all, M89-36 rifles shipped to the Congo were produced by AEP, Ancien Établissement Piper, while those made by Manufacture d'Armes de l'État, MAE, were often kept in Belgium. As it was done with the M89 rifle, only the best and most trustworthy Congolese soldiers in the Force Publique were issued the newly adopted M89-36 rifle. Now, Germany had not invaded the Congo and had not overrun it within 18 days as it had done in Belgium. Therefore, the Congo was still able to fight alongside the British in the Abyssinian Campaign of 1941 and the Expeditionary Force into Nigeria, July 1942 to February of 1943. During these campaigns, the Force Publique would still use the M89 and M89-36 rifle, using whatever ammunition they had left. By the time the Force Publique was fighting in the Middle East, it had exhausted its ammunition of the 7.65x53 ammo, and therefore they were issued British Lee Enfield rifles for the remainder of the war. Now, after World War II ended, the Congo and the Force Publique still used and issued the M89 and M89-36 rifles well up into the 1960s. And that makes the Congo the country to use this rifle the longest, beating Belgium, its country of origin. As with any army at the time, Belgium issued bayonets for their rifles. Prior to the Great War with the M89 rifles, there was the M89 Bayonet. It was a rather short bayonet, around 255 millimeters in length, blade length, and it had a quillion at the end of the handle. In around 1916, they adopted a new bayonet to replace the M89 Bayonet, and it came out with the M16 Bayonet, very similar to this one here. Many of these bayonets were converted from original M89 bayonets as they removed the quillion and changed the blade. Of course, during the Great War, many of these were newly produced for the M89 rifle. As we can see with this example here, they removed the quillion and the blades are much longer than 250 millimeters. I can guarantee you that right now. These bayonets during the war, when produced, were all over the place in terms of length. There was no standardized length. They range from around 338 millimeters to 450 millimeters. So that's quite a big difference. During the development of the M35 and M89-36, these bayonets were retained but converted to properly fit the modern rifles. In the muzzle ring, there was a bushing done to reduce the diameter from 17.5 millimeters to 15.5 millimeters. And we will do a close-up so we can see all the details in a moment. And the end of the pommel was reduced to better fit the rifle. Now, the Congo used the M89-35 bayonet, which was the original M89 bayonet, slightly converted to fit these new rifles. The bushing was done to the muzzle ring diameter from 17.5 to 15.5 millimeters, as well as the pommel slightly reduced to again better fit the rifle. Otherwise, they kept the same blade length and the quillion exactly the same. Now, there was a model M35 bayonet that was produced for the M35 and M89-36 rifle. Now, these bayonets were much more consistent in length, ranging from around 248 millimeters blade length. They greatly resembled as these, just a lot shorter, and of course there's no bushing since they were newly made. But those are rather rare and uncommon, and most of the time on Belgian soldiers you will find them with the very long M16-35 bayonets. An interesting side note, unfortunately I don't have an example, I might post a picture. There actually was a bayonet specifically made to act as a sort of monopod for the Belgian BAR. This was in response to the lack of mobile anti-aircraft guns, and the whole idea for this bayonet is that you would attach the bayonet to the front of the BAR, you'd hold it against you on your shoulder or something like that, and the BAR could shoot in the air at planes. That was the whole idea of it. Now, of course, you can imagine it wasn't a very good tool, as a monopod is not as stable as a bipod or tripod. You may not be able to really see how long this bayonet, but it is a very long bayonet. In fact, if I put it up to my armpit, it goes up to the palm of my hand. This is a very long bayonet. It's incredible. It's actually about 17 inches, instead of talking about millimeters. Now, these bayonets were very long. I don't know why Belgium continued to issue very long bayonets, but that's what it was. You can see many photos of Belgian soldiers with the bayonets just sticking all the way down the side of their leg. It's a very interesting idea, honestly, considering that their rifles are relatively shorter. But that being said, let's actually look closer at the bayonet and see what markings it has on for us today.
Alright, so now looking at the markings and taking a closer look at the bayonet, first thing you can see here is a contract number for the bayonet on the left side of it. Now, as you can see right next to it, there is a small inspector's part acceptance marking. On the base of the blade, there is a letter B, but I am sure of what this stands for. Before World War I, certain rifle accessories were marked with regimental markings, and they used a letter to denote which regiment that item was part of. If this is the case, the letter B would be part of the second line regiment, but I highly doubt this is the case, as many of these rifles were produced during World War I, and therefore regimental markings were very uncommon to newly produced rifles. Otherwise, you can see a simple wooden handle with a press release to take the bayonet off of the rifle. You can see the bayonet blade is very similar to a sort of label bayonet mixed with a simple bladed bayonet. It is very thin, but it is not a star shape similar to the label bayonet. Now, it might be very hard to see as this was very well done, but you can see on the muzzle ring there's a very faint line going all around the muzzle ring, and that is the bushing done to the bayonet to better fit the M35 or the M89-36 rifle. Basically what they did is they added a piece of metal into the muzzle ring to reduce the diameter. This would help the bayonet fit better on the new made rifles. So you can see it there. It's very hard to see. This one was very well done. Now looking at the scabbard, we can see another contract number. This one is not matching with the rifle, meaning that it was a mismatch at some point. On the tip of the scabbard, there is a number 34, and I have no idea what this means, as my sources do not mention any numbers on the tip of the scabbard, as well as there are no mentions of any two-digit numbers meaning anything. So whatever this number may be is as good a guess as any. Looking at the scabbard itself, you can see it's a very simple scabbard. You have a simple entrance here, rather thin scabbard as it was for a fairly thin blade. This particular example is in good condition besides some slight pitting at the very end there, and only really on one side. Otherwise, there's not much else to the scabbard itself.
So there we have it for the rifle. A short history into the M89-36 Belgian Mauser rifle. I tried covering as much information as I could, getting as much history out of it as possible. And I hope you guys learned something new today. Again, this video was heavily inspired by CN Arsenal and Forgotten Weapons. And please understand that my editing skills are not on par, as well as my research is probably not as extensive as it could have been, as I'm not sure where to find more information about this not very well-known rifle. If you enjoyed the video, please let me know by leaving a like, writing a comment, sharing, and subscribing. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you guys learned something today. And I hope you guys just enjoyed it in general. Now, if you did, let me know. Otherwise, you guys have a great day.